You got me right here.
Finish, my lady. Hold. Comitatus, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy.
Hail, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry for banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning, weeping, and valley of tears. To the most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy towards us. And after this, our child shown unto us, blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary.
Pray for us, the Holy Mother of God.
That we may be made worthy of the promises of Christ.
Mater Dei gratiae.
Ora pro nobis.
Sinless Montfort.
Pray for us.
Nos Gladiators.
Domini Catholica Maria.
Yeah. Oh, got a seat.
What?
Got a seat.
You don't have a chair, go get one. Well, you got one. We're going to put it all first.
From where?
Yeah.
Well, I did how much you said. I almost got really scared.
So here we are all dressed up and know where to go.
No water fight, Mitzel.
Hmm?
No water fight.
So what's happening here today is, since it's the last class before the tournament, honestly, 1 hour of drills and fencing is not going to improve your prospects of winning the tournament. You've either got what it takes at this point or not. So I thought, why don't we end the session with a bang? And so I brought weapons that, for the most part, I don't usually use in my chronology. They're different. They come from different countries, different time periods. So we're just going to go down across the table, and we'll see what we've got here. Okay? And actually, I think I'll take this off for ease. The history of weapons is just so interesting, and whether it is, I obviously prefer European weapons. However, that said, every country, there's probably not a country in the world, right, that doesn't have a martial art. I mean, even Buddhists have a martial art, right? Supposedly peace. So we're going to be all over the place here. One of the very first weapons, of course. And this is the jawbone of a Highland Kai, one of those great big cows that are in Scotland with great big horns and red shaggy fur. I had a fencing student whose parents owned a herd, and I was out walking around in their meadow, and lo and behold, I looked down. Perfect axe or warhammer, right? You can't get more organic than this. And you know, when you have one of these, you can't help but think of Samson, right, as well. But I mean, if you get hit with that, you're going to have problems if you don't have armor on, right? So perfect, even the teeth that fell out, forms a perfect handle. One of my all-time favorite subjects, of course, is film with swordplay in it. Some of the swordplay is good, some of it is bad. This, I think, is the most beautiful fantasy sword ever designed. This is a reproduction of the sword that Conan's father makes in the opening scene of Conan the Barbarian. And it's got an elk guard with horns, and it's got a hoof pommel. And if you pick this thing up, this is as heavy as the prop sword in the movie. The guys in Conan the Barbarian, the leads, were like Arnold Schwarzenegger, the football player Ben Davidson, Sven-Ole Thorsen, a Swedish bodybuilder. These guys were so big that they had to get special hangers to hang their costumes because the costumes were so heavy that they broke normal hangers. And the prop swords that those guys used weighed 10 pounds. They weighed this. But what was really interesting about this, making this film, which is probably 30 years old, they made casts of these, what they called the hero weapons, and then they recast the swords in fiberglass with threads of carbon going through it to strengthen them. And then they painted them just like the real swords. So that in long shots, in battle scenes, you had the actors using the carbon fiber swords, and in the close-ups, they were using these. And that revolutionized filmmaking and swordplay, because now everybody does this. Everybody makes rubber and fiberglass swords, from Lord of the Rings to Kingdom of Heaven to whatever. The actors use, for safety, the actors use, you can't tell them apart. And it's a little bit safer, right? But, so a nice hefty weapon for sure. And then you know, this was supposedly in an age called the Hyborian Age, which was between the sinking of Atlantis and the beginning of Western civilization. Of course, a fictitious age, but to swing over to historical, here we have a falcata, probably Roman, or maybe Etruscan, and this blade style spread all over Europe. Became the national weapon of Spain, and you can tell how successful a weapon is by how long it was in use. 700 years. From 3rd or 4th century BC to the 4th or 5th century AD. And the Romans hated Spaniards with this thing, because the cutting power of this is really quite something. The Greeks had a version called the kopis, and I think everybody looking at this would be reminded of the Gurkha kukri, right? These came in all sizes. Some of them were huge. The Roman Etruscan version was very, very large. The Spanish version was cut down a little bit, but a formidable weapon, particularly if you're wearing bronze armor and not iron. Right? And then, of course, we have it. Does anybody here have kukris? These things are pretty cheap. In Nepal, on New Year's Day, they have a kukri that is this big. And they got a water buffalo, and they cut the head off of the water buffalo. If you cut the head off of a water buffalo in one stroke, it's good luck for the regiment for the rest of the year. If it takes more than one stroke, bad luck for the regiment for that entire year. So they get their biggest, strongest, best fella to hit the water buffalo. When I was in India, I found a shop up in Nepal, in the foothills of the Himalayas. I didn't get there personally. I would have loved to. And they were probably the most famous makers of kukris in the world. And it was like going back to like 400 AD. I mean, they did everything by hand. And including, they would kill a goat and take its blood and sprinkle it all over the shop to sanctify the work that they were doing. They did blood sacrifices in 2000, right? Did you ever hear the story about, there's a little point right here. There is a story that goes, if a Gurkha pulls his kukri and it does not taste blood, he has to prick his thumb on the thumb prick before he can put it back in the sheath. This is hogwash. That is the symbol of one of their gods. It's a trident. It's actually a trident. And Shiva is one of the gods that holds a trident. So it's not a thumb prick. You hear that all the time. if you think about Celts, in this day and age, when you say Celtic, people normally think of Ireland and Scotland. But there are actually, did you ever hear of the 7 nations, the 7 Celtic nations? Now I can't remember all of them. But the Celtic civilization actually spread from Ireland to Switzerland during the time of the Roman Empire. Archaeologists look at all of Europe as Celtic. And it has only been very, very recently that the idea of Ireland being Celtic and Scotland being Celtic and Brittany being Celtic and Cornwall being Celtic. The Celtic culture was very wide, very varied. And this would have been a Celtic short sword. Obviously, it would have been carried at the side. Celts were chariot fighters. So they used javelins and they used spears as much as they went on foot then, of course, and some of these things are pretty large. The Celts believed that the soul was resident in the head. And they were head hunters. And when they came across a particularly strong and skillful opponent and they cut his head off, they would embalm the head with spices and herbs. And they would keep them in special chests. And when folks came over for dinner, after dinner conversation was, oh, this guy was really something. It took me 15 minutes of heavy duty combat before I got his head. And they would pass the heads around for everybody to enjoy, would you believe? If you look at Celtic art, heads are almost everywhere. They're on the harness of horses, they're on shields, just anywhere and everywhere. But this is actually a very nice little sword. If it was sharp, this would be a nice little sword to fight with. And then, of course, there's always Rome. This is a horrific copy of a gladius. It's actually got Celtic designs on the blade. It's just plastic grip, white metal. I mean, just Sherry got it. She got it for me real cheap too. There are 2 kinds of gladii, and I, for the life of me, can't tell you the difference between the Pompeii and whatever the other one is. But you know that the Roman legions just chewed up armies like a meat grinder. And you know about the pilum, the spear that they carried? Very, very long blade. Throw it. It hits the enemy and wounds them, or it hits their shield and goes through their shield. And what happens? The weight, because the blade of the pilum is probably about like that, very thin. When it goes through a shield, it bends, and all of a sudden you get 1 or 2 pilum in your shield, and you can't use your shield anymore. So what are you going to do? Throw it away. This is what the Romans wanted to have happen. So when you had a shield wall, they trained not to fight the person in front of them, but particularly if the barbarian did not have a shield, right to my right, they're usually using slashing swords, right? Long slashing swords. When the guy to my right, facing my neighbor, raises his arm to make a stroke under the armpit. So you always tried to kill the man, not in front of you, but the man to your right. Gladius has some cutting power, but obviously that point is quite something, right? And of course, Rome was very, very successful with that kind of fighting style. I have heard, don't know whether it's true or not, that during the 1745, when Bonnie Prince Charlie was marching towards London, that they beat a couple of English armies, and somebody, somewhere, got the idea with the British regulars to not fight the man in front of you. The Scot that's swinging his claymore at your partner, bayonet to the armpit. And the British Army was very, very successful in defeating the Highlanders because they were using exactly the same techniques as the ancient Romans. And when you think of a gladius, you can't help but think of gladiators. Gladiator sword. Here, this one, you have to hold this one. Just pass it along. This is a reproduction from the movie Gladiator.
Oh.
This is a reproduction of the sword used by Tigris the Gaul, supposedly the undefeated gladiator that the Spaniard Maximus beats. The costume designer Janty Yates, who won an Academy Award for costume design in Gladiator, is, for my money, the best costume designer in film today. She just does, even if the movie stinks, she does beautiful, beautiful work. And one of the things, of course, that they don't talk about very much is, the story is that gladiators were slaves. Actually, not all of them were. Some of them were actually noblemen who wanted to make money. Noblemen who came from impoverished families, they became gladiators. And of course, in Rome, if you look in our history book, a good history book, there are posters of gladiators like movie stars and rock stars. And the gladiators actually sold, like TV commercials, they actually sold stuff. Get olive oil from, right? They endorsed products. They were just like movie stars and rock stars today. They had fans, and in the gladiator fights took place in the Colosseum. The chariot races took place in the not the Colosseum, but the Circus Maximus. There were fans that were so fanatical that when their favorite charioteers were killed, people would go and throw themselves on the funeral pyre of their dead charioteer, and they would commit suicide because their life couldn't go on. Bread and circuses, right? Keep the population going with games 365 days a year, right? That was how to keep the people from realizing, and then free bread. That would keep the people from actually it's sort of like Burger King and American Idol, right? Now we have bread. We have the same thing, bread and circuses. We have these game shows like American Idol and The Voice, and we've got these fast food places where you can get food cheap. Well, it's not that cheap anymore, is it? Anyway. And one of the really kind of interesting things about gladiators was when Rome conquered a country, the warriors from that country became gladiators. So what you would definitely have would be during an afternoon of fighting, you would have Samnites from some far-flung country fighting ancient Britons, and probably it's very, very interesting to see the different fight styles coming together. There's a great book called Who's About to Die, about gladiatorial combat, and at the height of the games, the bestiarii, the gladiators who actually had to train animals to eat people, because the animals didn't want to eat people. And the animal trainers
First half.
The bestiarii, the gladiators who actually had to train animals to eat people, because the animals didn't want to eat people. And the animal trainers would actually have costumes with pieces of meat hanging on them. And they would actually teach the animal, the lions, to attack somebody and nibble. The animals didn't want to do that. You go out there and you got thousands upon thousands of people yelling and screaming, and how to train them, would you believe? They taught elephants to walk tight ropes across the width of the Colosseum. And there were little children dressed like Cupid with wings, and they would put these kids on wires and they would run them across the Colosseum, and the kids would have little bows and arrows, and they would shoot arrows into the audience that had numbers on them. And you could, if you got a number, you could take it down to the shops below the Colosseum, and you could claim, and you could win anything from a chariot to a house by the sea, or free lunch, or I mean, you know, I mean, when you read this book, there are a lot of things about ancient Rome that we're looking at right here and right now, like the lottery or something like that. And every so often, you got what looked like a boxed lunch, and you take it back and you open it up, and guess what's inside? Poisonous snakes. Is that just like too strange? Anyway, go figure. If you were a very successful gladiator, and you were actually a slave, and you were owned by a gladiatorial school, and you were really popular, and you really won a lot of bouts, you got a rudius. The emperor would give you a wooden sword, and that would mean you're free. And you know the symbol, the signs up and down? That changed through the years. Sometimes down meant spare them, and up meant kill them. And one of the most popular signals was, so at one point that definitely meant kill it. You know, when he's down and he holds up his, see, I forget which fingers he holds up. Oh, he holds up those three fingers. And he's asking the crowd for mercy. And sometimes, if they were very popular, you know, you could actually lose a couple of bouts, and the crowd would spare you. And God forbid, the gladiator that kills a popular guy that loses, crowd can turn really nasty. When a favorite is beaten and they kill him, you know. So, Rudy. Here's another terrible copy. This is also a copy from a Maximus sword from Gladiator. It's a spatha. It's a cavalry sword, right? If you're on horseback, you need a longer blade. And, you know, this could probably be the prototype for the medieval sword, without a doubt. You know, again, terrible, but cheap. And actually, I got this in a weapon swap, so I got it for nothing. So that's even better, right? But, and you know, the Roman cavalry, you know, they didn't use those large rectangular shields, right? They used oval shields, because it's easier to handle an oval shield on horseback than one of those big ones. One of the best movies physically about the Roman Empire. Well, you know what? I mean, you know, did anybody see Gladiator? Maximus the Spaniard. If Janty Yates, and she doesn't, no, I mean, she does a lot of research. She really does good work on, particularly on clothing. But if she had looked a little bit farther, do you know what sword the Spaniard should have been using? Spanish national weapon, right? Oh well, missed opportunity. By the time Rome fell, it's terrible. This is one of my favorite swords, and it's been hanging in my bedroom for a year and a half. I haven't touched it. It just breaks my heart. I got to clean this rascal up. When Rome fell, one could say, honest to God, the Dark Ages happened, not the Middle Ages. That was a wonderful thing. But the Dark Ages, when warlords, after the fall of Rome, what are you going to do? Barbarians were running all over Europe, burning, pillaging, looting. England was being invaded by Angles and Saxons and Utes from Denmark and Sweden. And this was way before feudalism. The idea of the comitatus developed. And the comitatus was a warlord, charismatic, smart, knew how to fight, could beat everybody up, in the region, and he became the person that communities started to be drawn towards. And so what happens? Well, you build a town, and you build a wall around the town, and you have got a warlord, and the idea of King Arthur is very much part of the comitatus mentality, where one leader draws to him a lot of good warriors. And the only thing that keeps them together, you know Beowulf? Beowulf, right? What did Hrothgar give his warriors at Heriot? He gave them golden mead, he gave them food, he gave them golden hilted swords and rings and bracelets, and he paid them. He paid them on the stuff that he got by raiding. And you know, Lord of the Rings? Well, you know why the wedding ring is so sacred? Because in the era of the comitatus, when a man gave someone a ring, it bound them until one or the other died. And that's why the wedding ring is so sacred, because it forms a bond going back to the comitatus era in the Dark Ages that bound two people together till death or after death. So this is a Swedish sword, but this is called a migration hilt. And migration hilts were used across Europe, very much often looking like this. And this led, I didn't bring a Viking sword along. This isn't a Viking sword. This is like a continental sword, a Swedish sword, something like that. Some of these swords, of course, had magical properties. Magical. And some of them would have a ring here, and tied to the ring would be a stone. And did anybody ever hear of Rolf Kraki? Famous Danish king, real life. But there's a great Viking saga called Rolf Kraki's saga. And of course, it has developed kind of like Beowulf, where there are critters in it, you know, all kinds of supernatural critters. But Rolf Kraki's sword Skafnung had a life stone. And if you wounded somebody with Skafnung, the superstition was the wound will never heal, and yet, unless you take the life stone and you rub it on the wound. Now this made, you know, fighting Rolf Kraki kind of a little tenuous, because if he wounds you, what are the chances he's going to come over and rub the life stone and he's going to cure your wound? Well, like slim and none. So these magical swords, they weren't really magical, but the reputation of these magical swords made these guys even more formidable psychologically than normal. And some of the work on these migration swords is absolutely beautiful. Did you ever hear of the Sutton Hoo treasure? The Sutton Hoo helmet? In the 1930s in southeastern England, somebody was digging and rooting around a little bit, and by George, it was a mound, and they started to find some really interesting artifacts. And to make a long story short, they opened up the mound, and lo and behold, there was a 7th century burial ship, Swedish. It was the Tutankhamun treasure of the British Isles. And if you want to see something amazing, look at the reconstruction of the Sutton Hoo helmet. It's got a faceplate with a mustache. The reproduction at the British Museum, it's hundreds of pieces, which they piece back together. And they have done several versions, one version of which is just absolutely, and I don't use the term often, because I'm like, it is absolutely awesome. You would not believe this helmet. And naturally there was a sword there, very similar to this, and a shield, and all kinds of artifacts. Sutton Hoo, Suttonhoo. If you want to see something absolutely positively amazing, look Sutton Hoo up. You might even have books in your library that have pictures of Sutton Hoo. Anything about Britain in the Dark Ages will have at least one or two pictures of the Sutton Hoo treasure. So, yes, magical swords. Well, and the deal with magical swords is that there's no weapon quite like this, and as I often say in the Middle Ages, there's nothing today that represents what this meant in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, right? Because you had these swordsmiths and they really didn't know why the blades that they were making were the way they were. Flexible, kept a sharp edge. They only knew that if you did this, big magic. and these guys, got a reputation. Most of the swordsmiths did not want anybody else to know how to make swords. And kings did not want anybody else to know how to make swords. So generally, I don't want to say that the swordsmith was a prisoner, but the king kept a pretty close eye on him. He had his own little hut, and because he wanted to keep the secret of making sword blades, he worked by himself. And he often worked in the middle of the night, because at night you can see the sparks and the little embers and everything that you can't see during the day, which is actually saying that the swordsmithing process is working. So swordsmiths worked at night, away from everybody else, and some of them had songs, and they would sing a song and they would pound the metal for as long as it took to sing the song. So it was pretty easy to begin to think about the fact that swordsmiths were magicians. They worked alone, they had curious songs that they sang over what they were doing right. And it's even like in the Middle Ages, to boil an egg, and I don't know how many, but if the lady of the house wanted to make some hard-boiled eggs, she would put them in water and she would say 5 Aves. I mean, they actually used prayers to time cooking. I mean, that's how much religion was part of everyday life, right? Anyway, so you had these guys that were, and now this blade is not flexible at all. This is it's a little bit blade heavy, but you have to batter through shields, and you got to go through iron helmets, and you got to go through mail. But after the fact, you can come up and heft these things, right? Since I normally, I never did this before, so I have no idea where I'm going with this chronology. So we're sneaking into the Middle Ages. I do so much about the Middle Ages that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Here's the Henry V sword, which is one of my all-time favorite swords. It's the arming sword, which was used by a nobleman on horseback in particular, because the short blade allowed you to ride side by side with an enemy and fish around for those openings in his armor, right? Here, armpit. The armpit was always popular, because it's almost impossible to protect the armpit once the arm is raised, right? Perfect target. I was kind of vaguely mini heartbroken because there's a great special on the history of modern jousting. It is how guys started to learn how to joust in the 1960s. It's 45 minutes present day where we're finally really jousting again, with not breakaway lances. Just the fact that they reproduced a medieval saddle made you wouldn't believe the difference between a modern English saddle that's turned into a medieval saddle, and you look at Henry V's saddle at Westminster Abbey and you recreate that, you wouldn't believe the difference in jousting from the two different saddle styles. The Henry V saddle keeps you secure in the saddle unless your horse gets knocked down. And if you're stuck in a saddle, and modern recreations of medieval saddles kind of hold you, if your horse gets knocked over, and your horse, oh, that did not sound good. Hopefully it wasn't the booze. What? Alcohol. Alcohol.